All right, guys, Satanic Panic today. All right, so it's Mike. I'm here with Ben, and we're just going to have a conversation about Satanic Panic because we both kind of experienced some of that. And I think we need to give some appropriate background overview to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So just to set the scene, all right, for us to talk about what that meant for Christianity, what that meant for culture and theology and everything else. So let me back up just for a bit here. 1979, it's a guy named James Dallas Egbert III, and he is at Michigan State University. And there at Michigan State University, he's playing a game. And this game has only been out, I think, since '74, so it's like 5 years or so, Dungeons and Dragons. All right. So he's playing this game periodically. But what's interesting about him is that he was known as something of a child prodigy. He was extremely intelligent. And that's the reason he was at Michigan State University, because he was only 16 years old. Okay. So he's staying in dorms at Michigan State University, and he goes missing. The parents don't know about it for several days because the university didn't contact the parents when he went missing. And so they hired a private investigator to try to figure out where he was. His name was William Deere, and he went on this expedition looking for him through tunnels and all sorts of things. And he came to the conclusion while doing the investigation that this boy had confused fantasy with reality. Right. And he was trying to live out Dungeons and Dragons, and so he's trying to go underground and find all these tunnels and everything else. And he actually does do that to a certain extent. We found out after the fact. Okay, years later, it's not until years later till we figure out, because William Deere didn't speak to anybody for a while because he was writing a book, his own book about the situation.
Right.
And he was missing for about a month, right? But this month was sort of chaotic for a lot of people because William Deere is convinced that Dungeons and Dragons has caused this thing to happen. But then we find out after the fact that James had gone into actually a utility tunnel up under Michigan State University and attempted to take his own life. Woke up because it didn't work, and then began to stay with various people in Michigan in their homes while William Deere is still searching the tunnels looking for him, believing that he was caught up in some satanic reality in daily life. Okay, but all the while that this is happening, he actually does is take a bus and leaves there and goes to New Orleans. So he leaves and goes to New Orleans, again attempts to take his own life, this time with cyanide. Did not work again. He did not take enough. And then decides he needs to do something else. So he leaves to go to another nearby city, Morgan City.
I didn't know that.
You did not know that, did you? No. He goes to Morgan City and began work as a roustabout in the oil field. And that is where William Deere eventually catches up with this fella and takes him back home to his parents. And he doesn't actually just catch up with him because he had no clue where the guy was. James Egbert contacted him and told him where he was. And so William drove there to Morgan City, picked him up, and brought him back home. And so he's back home again. And some year later, sometime in 1980, I don't remember the exact date, I think it's in August or so, he takes his own life, this time with a gun. And so he attempted to take his life 3 times. The 3rd time actually did it. And William Deere was convinced that this was because of the game Dungeons and Dragons. Like there was some window into the satanic world or to demons in some way. And that sort of would have passed, I think. But something else happened. Several years later, Lee Pulling another student, 17 years old, in 1982, takes his own life after playing, guess what, Dungeons and Dragons. And his mother is absolutely convinced that Dungeons and Dragons made him do it, and that he was sucked into some demonic experience. And so she created an organization called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. It was called BAD. And she partnered with some, I don't know who it was. It was a non-denominational pastor who began to promote her, and she was speaking in various churches. And then this thing sort of began to spread like wildfire across the United States. And this is in 1982, all right? So this is spreading throughout the United States, and then it jumps across the border into Canada, and then all the way across the pond into the UK. And people are becoming concerned, and they're looking for people playing these games, Dungeons and Dragons, by which, by the way, they were selling some 30 or 40,000 copies a year by that point, and thinking that people were getting sucked into some demonic experience. And they were playing with fire, and that demons were going to get them and possess them and cause them to kill themselves. And the general, not the rule really, but the general way of looking at it was that Dungeons and Dragons led to suicide. That was sort of that way because of some demonic possession or influence, and it was causing people to kill themselves. It was such an issue, and there were so many people involved, that sheriff's departments were warning parents. They would come on, there were PSAs on local television stations telling people to watch out for your children, the games that they're playing, because of what's happening. There are people killing themselves because of it. And there was so much play of this that the CDC ends up having to look at this. And they looked at the data, and they found zero correlation between playing Dungeons and Dragons and the background suicide rate. In other words, it was exactly the same. So Canada followed suit, did the same thing to appease their people. They found had the same results. Same thing happened in the UK. But in the middle of all that, there are two other things that happened too. In between those two individuals, a new church play started called Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames. That's 1981. And then the year after the second fellow, Lee Pulling, Judgment House was created in 1983. And both of those plays began circulating widely through churches, as a way to use that cultural moment to try to bring people in to Christianity. And there's lots of aftermath because of this. It's known as either the moral panic or the satanic panic of the 80s. So, Ben, you have some, I don't know, what's your insight into this? I mean, do you have a...
So, when all that was happening, I remember a conversation between my mom and my grandmother on the front porch. Mm-hmm. Something to the effect of, hey, you don't play that game, do you? And it was very brief, never heard of it before. Mm-hmm. Later on in college, high school, I had a few experiences with it, but at that point in time, I'd never heard of it.
So do you think, though, asking the question made you want to think about, I actually want to know what that is now?
But it piqued a curiosity, sure.
Yeah.
The other thing is, though, there was this more to it, satanic panic sort of thing. Like, there were cults out in the woods.
Right, that's right. That's birthed out of this same thing.
I've been having thought about this leading up to the podcast. Some of the things like you had the Manson murders coming out of the 70s and some things like that.
Right.
People stealing kids and making stickers with LSD on it and some things like that. They were afraid of all those sorts of things. There's a big, like, almost a fear movement.
That's right.
And it does lead into the whole Heaven's Gates things, because it's sort of a fear tactic to get people into the church.
I think Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames, and Judgment House played off the same thing.
Right.
There was that cultural fear, and I think that it was more widespread than just inside the church. It was it was just a cultural phenomenon.
It was everywhere.
Yeah,
everywhere.
Because we're coming out of like an interesting era. I think rock and roll. In fact, the guy who plays Satan typically, or in the VHS that later comes out for Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, he kind of looks like Gene Simmons.
Right.
I mean, with the black and white paint and everything.
And you're kind of still the old medieval Satan with the red pitchfork and all of that. That's in the 80s. He's around.
That's right. That's right.
Well,
because rock and roll, like the dangers of rock and roll and syncopated music and all this kind of things. And
backmasking was
exactly. We're gonna play the music backwards, and you can hear Satan speak through the music.
I'm told some of the bands actually got into that.
They may have tried to play into that to provoke people and to sell their music, because now someone's curious, they want to buy it and run it backwards to see if they can make it happen.
Right.
Kids do things just for the sake of doing the thing.
Right.
Not necessarily with evil intent or something, but just to do it. But I think that's right. I think it's the fear was kind of the main plot, and all of this other stuff that was happening were little subplots that were happening along the way. Right. Because if you look back before this, the first people that create haunted houses are Christians.
Right.
I
even remember, there was a point where we stopped celebrating Halloween.
That's right.
But prior to that, the church had their own haunted house. I mean, they had the whole thing where you would go in the dark room and there's this bowl with grapes in it, and you're supposed to think that's eyeballs or whatever. Right. And that was at church. I mean, they wouldn't think of doing that.
When I was a kid, I think the best places to find a good haunted house, you thought was a good one, that one that was scary, that was whatever, was at a church.
Right.
And it didn't matter the denomination.
Right.
You had certain churches that were good at those things, and they were putting those on, and that was sort of all in the air at that time.
Right.
And so it made sense, I think, Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames and Judgment House coming out at that time, because that sort of played into that that same idea that people were participating in.
The razor blades and the candy thing.
The same problem, isn't it?
Was there any truth to that anywhere?
I don't think so. So you looked into that before, because I remember when I was a kid, you go on Halloween, and first thing we had to do when we get home was, first of all
the candy up,
or not eat it first.
Right.
You couldn't eat it until you got home, and then you got home and you had to dump the candy out on the floor, and my parents had to inspect it.
Yep.
And after inspecting it, then say, okay, now it's okay for you to eat some of this. But if the wrapper looked funny, or if there's something going on, then we have to be very careful, because somebody could have either put a razor blade in it,
right,
or done something to it to taint it, to poison it, or whatever.
And then everybody we went to for trick-or-treating purposes was family, and they still did that.
Exactly. It's so odd. It's so odd. But, these early haunted houses, what I'm talking about, were back in the 40s and the 50s.
Okay.
They started doing it then.
Yeah, pretty early.
Right? And I think it's because of again, I keep talking about these cultural moments, but you're coming out of World War II, and you thought, or at least the people in the U.S. thought, we'd already fought the Great War.
Right.
We fixed it. Right?
Problem solved.
Problem solved. We, got rid of these empires. We redrew lines, geopolitical lines. We've adjusted leadership. We got rid of the evil people in the world. And so everything's going to be good now. And then it wasn't. and in fact, the U.S. they're not prepared, because they're still not the kind of standing army that we have today.
Right.
Which is why they have to institute the draft again.
Right.
Right.
Twice more.
Yes.
Right.
Because it's not there. We haven't ramped up to that. We didn't think we needed it.
Right.
And all of this is happening, but then you get into the 1950s, and I think we're going to talk about this in another podcast, but getting into the Cold War and nuclear weapons and stuff. So now there's this other fear.
Well, and so you could almost make a correlation between the Red Scare over communism coming out of the 50s.
Yeah.
And looking at the Satanic Panic in the 80s, very similar. Like,
it is.
You have a list of people who are communists. Well, these list of people are practicing some cult out in the woods. It's kind of the same idea.
Yeah, and that it's such a strange set of events, right? So you have all this sort of fear in the background, and then you're just waiting on something to stoke it,
right?
Essentially, and it's these one-off events, and I'm not making light of James Egbert or Lee Pulling, right?
To make a connection with D&D, D&D, Gary Gygax, the guy that creates that, he's into wargaming. Well, that's obviously coming out of World War II. He's playing these war games, and he decides to put a fantasy setting on it, which, it hadn't been that long that Tolkien had been published. In fact, the Tolkien estate actually sued him on the first edition because he used the term Hobbit in it. He had to change that to halfling.
I see.
So just kind of an interesting point of fact there.
Well, the other thing about it too I looked up is that he was a supposedly a devout Jehovah's Witness, a practicing Jehovah's Witness.
Christians, whatever. But,
But so if he was Jehovah's Witness, he certainly wasn't wanting to fool with. They're fundamentally stricter on some issues, right?
Right.
I mean they're known for not celebrating Halloween, right? They're known for not wanting to dress up that way. So for him to have created that, his intention is not to lead people down some evil path.
That's
right? But these events, again, all come together at that moment, and it's kind of like the beginning of the World Wars, right? Where everything is sort of set up, the pins are set up, and the ball rolls down and knocks it over, and everything falls like a house of cards.
Sort of a perfect storm.
It is.
Right.
And so all this stuff is set up. James Egbert, along with that particular private investigator, if it would have been any other private investigator, he probably wouldn't have come to the same conclusion, right? And that changes everything. Or Lee Pulling and his mother, if that situation didn't materialize in the way that it did, it probably doesn't set off the same alarm bells.
Right.
But it did. And then everything spilled out from that. We were still in the middle of, when I was a kid, I'm assuming you guys did it too, but, nuclear drills at school, right? Hiding under the desk and all this other stuff.
Not to the duck and cover point, but, the idea that it could.
Exactly. It was in the air. It was in the air, right? Of this fear that was still there, especially before the Berlin Wall came down and all that. There was something else in the air. It was this unknown. And I think it's Alfred Hitchcock said once that the monster off camera is worse than the one that's on camera.
Right.
Because the unknown is worse.
It plays on your mind.
It does. Yeah. You get to make up whatever you want. And that's something interesting about D&D, because it's really a game of imagination, is it not?
Yeah.
It's free form.
It's make-believe with rules is what it is.
Okay. And I think kids know how to play. Like,
it's easy to figure out.
I'm just saying in general they know how to play. Like if they have imaginary friends, they pretend to be on a space shuttle, they work on a car that's actually the chair. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
The imagination is already there. It's not like they're instructing people on how to imagine. Right? You're a character and you're part of that world. And then they turn it off and come inside and eat dinner and
it might provide a little bit of fuel for that. Like, for example, you've got a monster manual that contains goblins and this and that.
Sure.
You may not have thought of, I'm playing, as we would play, cowboys and Indians or cops and robbers. I'm the elf against the goblin. They may not have put that together, but
right.
That's kind of the direction it heads in.
Yeah, and so I think earlier we was talking about these cultural moments. Well, those cultural moments turned into a cultural era of effect on the church.
Absolutely.
And the rise really in lots of things like particular end times prophecies and how that was playing into all of this. But it's secondarily the things I think that affected us at that time are what we were allowed to watch or do.
Right.
did you have programs that you weren't supposed to watch?
You know, that's a long conversation.
Sure.
So just to kind of pick it apart in pieces is, you know, we went to video game rental and movie rental on the regular. Like that was something we did. You know, once a weekend I'd go over to my grandmother's. We'd rent either games or movies, and there was a section of the, you know, video game rental store we stayed away from.
I see.
And that, of course, is the horror section.
Right.
Now, the odd thing about that is, you know, my parents would make comments about my cousin. You know, he has a hard time sleeping, but that's probably because of what they let him watch. You know, he was allowed to watch horror movies.
I see.
I was prevented from watching.
I see.
You know.
Yeah, but I'm thinking like even into the realm of like cartoons. You know.
The Smurfs.
Like the Smurfs.
Gargamel was seen as...
He's a wizard.
A wizard.
So if he's a wizard, and there's in Dungeons and Dragons, there's a wizard, right? And so, well, that opens the door, right? And even though I have so many more questions about the Smurfs than the wizard,
right?
You know,
yeah.
there's one woman. There's Papa Smurf, and there's a whole bunch of others. How'd that happen, right?
That work?
Like, did they spore out? I don't know. But, you know, there's a lot of weirdness in some of those things. And, you know, but that, or Scooby-Doo,
right?
You know. I was
allowed to watch Scooby-Doo.
Well, and it makes sense that you would have, right? But some people weren't, even because at the end of the show, there's the unmasking every time. It wasn't a ghost.
Right.
It wasn't a whatever, because... You know, if it wouldn't have been for you kids, right? And they pull off the mask, and it's some guy that they know.
And oddly enough, we would watch this, you know, Bewitched on television, where the same cousin that's watching the horror movies was not allowed to watch that because it was a witch. And that's kind of ironic.
Yeah. Yeah, you get Bewitched, with the wiggle of the nose, and, you know, something happens. And that was kind of, that was prime time, what, 1950s? 60s?
Well, it's colorized. It'd probably be the 60s.
60s, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was still
syndication.
It was. Yeah, and so it was still, the reruns were on TV by that point, and so yeah, it is an odd thing, you know. But particular cartoons and books and those but especially games, and I think that the game world is because. You could do that alone,
right?
Maybe that's why.
The thing is, the video games kind of made a way for us to get access to things that we would not have had access to if it was board games or otherwise.
Yeah.
For example, you know, D&D is not a whole lot of different from The Legend of Zelda.
Yeah.
But nobody batted an eye when we rented The Legend of Zelda and played that for days on end. You know.
Right.
But if it had D&D written on it, that would have been a hard no.
Yeah. So again, it's that weirdness that came out of that spawned out. You know, the other thing that I find interesting about this is that the same people that were saying, well, you shouldn't watch the Smurfs and you can't play D&D, would also turn us loose and not see us for hours at a time and have no concern about that.
Yeah, go play outside.
Yeah. You know, it's like...
by.
Exactly. Where? Just
stay
get out.
Well, there was a stay in the neighborhood sort of thing.
Well, sure.
You know.
But I mean, if there's a stay in the neighborhood, but they really didn't know.
Mine were pretty protected.
There was no tags.
So they would, if it was a certain amount of time, they'd come looking. You know. But.
Yeah, it is, but I think,
mine tended to be on the protective side.
It is, but it's still sort of that, in Gen X, there's still that idea of no...
Well, yeah, we're the latchkey kids.
Exactly.
We're the ones that had that.
There's no helicopter parenting going on. It is sort of, there's adults in here, get outside. Why are you in the house?
Right.
Like if it's daytime, why are you here?
Right.
Right. Go away. And so you had to go away and go outside and play and do whatever.
Right.
And you could have done anything. You know, you're jumping off of things. We jumped ramps with bikes and did things that were extremely dangerous.
Well,
right.
My first major scar came from a guy down the street said, "Here's a ski rope. Pull me on my skateboard with your bike."
Exactly.
You know, my parents were down the street. I had to go find them.
Yeah.
And you know, they were a little bit upset when they saw my bloodied arm, but I mean, you know.
Sure. But you didn't play D&D.
I did not.
You see, that's the, well,
you know, when I got to when I got to college, that's a different story. But you know, there's some interesting thing that we're going to get to about that. I think. But I don't want to jump the gun. So
sure. I mean, because I think, but we're kind of going that way now because I think following that up, there's still sort of the leftovers of that movement are still present today, right? And because things that came out after the fact, after we had grown up, essentially, like Harry Potter, right? I remember,
but definitely a stigma on that.
Obviously, there was a stigma on Harry Potter because what's the problem? Well, they're witches, wizards. They're casting spells. This is evil, and it's directly connected to the demonic. And then you could trace the roots of that movement all the way back to Dungeons and Dragons and these events that happened in 1979, 1980.
But you don't hear an outcry against the Lord of the Rings necessarily.
You don't.
But if you don't have the Lord of the Rings, you don't have Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, you know what's so funny about that too, though? I mean, Dungeons and Dragons. I'm sorry,
Lord of the Rings.
The Lord of the Rings is Tolkien's way of addressing good and evil in the world.
Right.
You know, that's C.S. Lewis's version of. It's the equivalent of C.S. Lewis's Lion, the Witch, Narnia. You know, Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe, and all the rest. And you know that's what he was doing. In fact,
they're both fantasy.
They are fantasy, you know. and he would even in C.S. Lewis's works. I mean, you've got Mr. Tumnus, which is a strange creature, right? You've still got those same kinds of elements in
Lewis
here.
draws a lot on the Greek mythology, you know, where Tolkien stays clear of it.
Well, because Tolkien, though, wanted to invent his own, right?
That's right.
He says Europe didn't have its own sort of mythology to borrow from.
England. Yeah.
That's what I meant. England. England didn't have that, and so he wanted his own stuff.
Right.
And so he sort of recreated it, or created it as if it would have been there all along, kind of. And what's funny is they chide each other about their writing.
Yep.
You know, where
Tolkien didn't like allegory.
He didn't like allegory. He didn't like what C.S. Lewis did with, Narnia. Specifically, he's like, look, it's very obvious that Jesus is Aslan. Right. So that's too direct. You need to be more subtle than that.
Right.
And I think that's probably what he was going for with the White Wizard with Gandalf.
Right.
Because he goes away and becomes the White Wizard and comes back. And all that, and you see that kind of play out. But anyway, this whole movement, it makes its way into today, and there's the leftovers of it still, as if it had been part of theology all along. As if it had been part of the theology all along. When not long ago, there were celebrations of Halloween. Right. Because if you have a haunted house at a church, what else are you going to call it, right? Now today we have things like, Fall Festival or Harvest Festival or Harvest Fest or whatever people want to call it.
Right.
But it's still around the same thing, but now it's no scary costumes, no gory looking things and all that.
I remember we had a thing at church where we had to dress as a biblical character. I actually managed to pull off Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Wow, all at once.
Yeah, I had two cutouts that I walked around with. Pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, and see, that was what was happening, though. We were sort of this steering back into another direction because of the fear that it was going to drive people to demonic activity. And, that's, again, still present. But so is there any other after effects or things that stayed with you because of that, or any other stories that maybe that you'd like to...
Theologically, coming from what I consider a fundamentalist background, we had a pretty strong dispensational eschatology. That's probably big words, but we saw ourselves as living in the Laodicean period of the church.
Right. The lukewarm people.
The lukewarm people trying to get the country back on the right track, sort of thing. Not that I don't hold to strong, what I would consider strong fundamental beliefs, but that way of thinking has kind of gone by the wayside, I think.
So it was a mindset really more than a theological stance.
So. I think so. But, we saw the world of angels and demons a little bit differently than what I've come to realize reality is.
Yeah.
It
was almost like that time we saw them flying around like they were like gnats or something.
Yeah.
It was sort of everywhere. If you weren't careful, it was just right there.
Right.
And now there's more of a distancing of that, I think.
Well, I can remember, getting into the youth group. I was probably a 7th or 8th grader. And one of the very first things we did at church in the youth group was we studied satanic cults and how to avoid them. And we went the full 9 yards. There was evidence presented that, somewhere in some place they had sacrifices done, things like that.
Right.
And you come to find out when you look in the Satanic Panic now that there was literally no evidence whatsoever.
Right.
And it's sort of mind-blowing in a way, because
it is. Like, how does it become so much of like center stage with nothing there? It was essentially smoke and mirrors.
Right.
But once you convince yourself of something, it is hard to let that go. We were talking about earlier, like sheriff's department warning people and things like that. So that makes it really official.
Right.
If a sheriff's deputy or the local sheriff begins to warn people on air, on TV, personally, whatever, about this issue that's sweeping the nation,
right,
then man, it hits home. And at that time, it wasn't really a good way to get information, right?
Right.
You had the nightly news.
You had it on the news, maybe the radio.
Yeah, and then if the people on the news, that's right, and if the people on the news are saying it,
right,
that's it. That's everybody.
Right.
If people on the news are saying it, it's spreading in the church, law enforcement is talking about it, that's the whole world. We
have a place in Bay Vista. Everybody knows the Skeleton Hill. In fact, I was having a conversation about it with my dad. Apparently, when he was younger, there was some sort of, nefarious events taking place there.
I see.
And so that was always the legend that kids would go out to Skeleton Hill to do such
evil things.
Right.
Yeah, and that tied into all that, right? Because there was always this. Everybody had the story.
Right.
Every town had the story, because it seems like it's like this giant game of telephone.
Right.
Somebody tells this story, and then before you know it, it's your story, even though it had nothing to do with your area at all, and it may not have even happened, but
right,
it doesn't matter. Now it's your story, and these teenagers went out there and painted pentagrams everywhere, right, had candles lit, and drew things on the ground, sacrificed a goat. Now they're looking for a kid to sacrifice, and they're going to bring Satan up, into the community, to the world, because that's what they really want, right? And
plot of a horror movie.
Exactly, it is the plot of a horror movie, but that was the buy-in, right? I feel like Christians got sold a bill of goods of because at that time, horror movies were sort of now coming into their own.
Right.
And that got...
John Carpenter's Halloween is
exactly
in the 70s, coming right into that moment.
That's right. And it played into it, and it was sort of... They sucked it in as part of it being truth of the world. And now, we sort of look back at that, but we don't look back at it, actually. We look back and think about theology, that this is the way that we've always thought about it. This is the way that everybody's always had this certain mindset, I guess that you were meaning earlier.
Right.
That we've all, this is the mindset that it means, this is the mindset you're supposed to have to be a Christian, I guess is what I'm saying. But that sort of birthed into the world. It wasn't there.
Well, we've got Old Testament scriptures that tell us to avoid witchcraft, right?
Sure.
And so that's a lot of times that someone that's coming out against something like D&D, that's the scripture they're going to hearken to try to say, hey, this is wrong.
Right.
Because you're make-believing.
Yeah.
But seems to be witchcraft to them.
Sure.
You know.
The problem, I think the trouble with that, though, is like, you know, if we're looking at Old Testament passages, you're going back to Deuteronomy or to Leviticus, and, you know, the idea of witchcraft at that time, or what we translate into witchcraft in English, doesn't mean, you know, oh, hocus pocus,
right,
you know, kind of thing. What they meant was connecting literally to some divine realm and speaking to some other god,
right,
right? And that's not what people were doing when they're pretending.
right.
It's not really the same thing.
There's a little bit of that.
There could be.
Yeah.
There absolutely could be. But there's a difference in the world
well, D&D does have a pantheon.
Of course.
Yeah.
But there's not this intention, I guess, from the beginning that I want to contact some other god, or I want to contact
that this is ever real.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the whole thing, right?
Exactly. So, because if you're looking at it from Leviticus or Deuteronomy, the idea was that there were people out there who were essentially priests or priestesses of some other religion that are calling upon their gods to do something in the world.
Right.
And that was witchcraft. Right? That's what happens when, even in Egypt, with, you know, when Moses is there and you have this sort of showdown between Moses and the priests of Egypt.
Right.
It's that. It's calling on, you know, Osiris or whoever, you know, one of their gods,
right,
and trying to cause something to happen. It's back to what happens with the prophet when who's the prophet? I just lost my train of thought here. The prophet that goes back, that he's the only one left, right? Elijah. Wow, I don't know why I couldn't think of that.
Yeah.
But Elijah, you know, and they have the whole showdown with him and the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, right? He's telling them to do it, and then watch, I'm going to do it. And so there's this weirdness that's happening in Scripture too, of trying to tease out, you know, what's real and what's not real. And by the time you get to the prophets, you have prophets saying things like there is no other God. There's only one, right? And so it's foolish to believe that this other God even exists at all, to have some kind of impact or effect on you. Isaiah, right? He says, I am Yahweh, right? I bring Ra and I bring Shalom.
Well, and then that comes into the, you know, the Christian duality that would have been present in the 80s, where, you know, God is all powerful, but they give the devil a bit more power than what I think he actually has. And that kind of leads into our next thing, I think, because encountering things in college at a different level.
Yeah. So
the first time I ever encountered D&D directly, my friend in high school, it was probably junior year, he had one book, and I happened to notice the artwork in it, and I thought it was kind of cool. But then I saw Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and I was kind of like, probably ought to not mess with that, you know. And so it wasn't until college rolled around that I actually participated.
Yeah.
But even participating then, we did it very carefully. If we came, I was playing with some friends from Berwick, which is the town right next door to mine, and we would come home on the weekends or whatever, and we would still play.
Yeah.
But I felt like I couldn't tell my parents, "Hey, I'm playing D&D."
Right.
And we had another role-playing game based on Star Wars, and we would play both. So if I was going to go over there and do that, I'd just tell my parents, "Hey, we're going to play Star Wars."
Right.
You know. And so it wasn't really a lie, but we were kind of...
You were going to play Star Wars, but you just didn't say what you were also going to play.
That's right.
Yeah.
So... and you know, we were playing D&D and got into it a little bit, and it's playing a role.
Yeah,
what it is.
It's a fantasy game.
You know, I had other friends, and the thing is, there's almost this dual world here, because I'm also encountering the BSU at the time, and getting in with some friends there, and you know, everybody has their story where they've seen a demon or something like this. You know,
right.
And
it's sort of like the thing I said earlier. It's all become your story too. You know, when people start telling stories and telling their own experience, it sort of becomes yours.
Well, and one of the stories that I heard connected this whole idea to King's Quest, which is a video game, that I really don't feel has any connection to this discussion, but
Yeah.
Their particular story where they saw a demon manifest had to do with that. And then I had another friend who said that he had some friends playing first edition D&D and that a demon manifested from one of the books.
Yeah.
And that second edition had gotten rid of that stuff. But
I don't even know what to do with that information. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, how do you? I don't even know what to say to that.
I've never observed anything like that.
Well, yeah, I know, because I'm like, how does that even mean?
Now, I have encountered what I think would be considered demon possession.
Sure, if you're that's, but we're talking about here specifically, like something coming out of the game,
right?
Right. Because of particular cards or die or pieces in the game.
And then in the 90s, of course, Magic the Gathering becomes popular. And
it's the same thing. It's the same thing.
It carries the same
stigma. Yeah. In that, so what's funny about all this is that it's a mass-produced game on an assembly line, right?
Right.
But they're like inserting demons into on the assembly line. It's such a weird, take.
It's kind of like on the music front, where once Jimmy Page was questioned if they had put stuff backwards on the disc, and he said he was spending too much time putting it right side on the disc.
That's right.
To be worried about.
Music is hard, man. So you can imagine, you're having to figure out, especially in that era. Right, tech wasn't what it is now. We could just flip something around in 2 minutes and do it, But then it was more difficult to do that.
Right,
you're sort of having to, if you have to record and then now let's play it backwards and see if it worked, and if it didn't work, or do I have to record it first backwards and then see how to play that? That's a lot of work. You almost have to. Praise somebody for being able to do it. To put it backwards on there, that's hard. But again, even if there's something like that, you have to believe, and this is again goes back to the mindset, that if you play this particular piece of music backwards, and it says something about Satan, right? Whatever it is, doesn't matter. That when you're playing that music forward and just listening to it like a normal song, because it can be played backwards, and it says something else.
Subliminal messages.
Sure, but how is your brain running it in reverse?
Not doing that.
And even if you are, you have to think that almost in a magical sense.
Right. Well, that's very much the way the thinking was.
Exactly. It has to be almost in a magical sense that, you could be possessed or become influenced by some demon because it was present on that album, like a physical thing,
right?
In that way, and that's kind of a medieval.
It was very much medieval.
It's a medieval way of thinking about the world,
right?
And that really kind of went away in the modern era, right?
Yeah.
And then it came back.
I think in the 90s. Growing up and teenagers and this and that, there's almost a blowback on some of that.
Yeah.
And you do have some youth kind of experimenting with the Satanic Church and some things like that, where that's a different thing.
It's a completely different animal, I think.
It's a different thing.
Because what starts to happen there is you have these, leaders of what's called the Satanic Church, which is really atheist group. Right?
It's a rebellion against the church.
It is a rebellion against the church, and it would be part of the group that we would now, at least from a ministry point of view, called nuns. So they have no religious affiliation, right? Almost atheist evangelicals, right? So atheist evangelists, rather, to promote science and to buck.
And I knew people that
thinking in the world that was magical.
We would say they fell off, but I mean, we knew people that had gotten there. And as a youth minister, I had kids that came to me that one recovering from that.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads into Satanic Panic, because he told me some things about different software companies and things like that. And I took it for what he was saying, and I actually burned some of my Warcraft stuff, try to get rid of that sort of thing.
It makes me think about the it was some gathering where the woman is on there. This is almost it's really a meme. It's being shared a lot of times. It's gone viral anyway. This woman's talking about a Monster can, Monster energy drink, and saying how it's satanic, and it will lead your kids to Satan, and you get demons and all that from drinking it. And she goes on to explain all these different elements of it. And that is the leftover, I think, from that era.
It's a carryover, but I think you also get that because there's a huge interest in paranormal.
You get that too.
And with something like the Travel Channel, per se, they say that 3 scratches is a demonic sign. And things like that. And Monster clearly plays into that.
And we see pareidolia everywhere. Pareidolia is just the ability, we see patterns and faces and things.
Right.
And we can lay on the ground and look up at the clouds and see all sorts of animals and everything. Our brains fill in the gaps.
And I think it may be time to bring the eschatology into the discussion, because that's, having the viewpoint that it's going to occur in the way that if you're reading Revelation extremely literally from point A to point B.
So you were going to talk about eschatology and how that kind of ties in.
Right.
Because it's about the same time period when everything becomes... Right, Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet Earth, and then 88 Reasons Why Jesus Come Back in 1988.
All of that, plus you've got the whole, heavy metal movement where, there is a kind of a bent towards Satan in that direction, but what they're really doing is they're trying to protest the way
it's a rebellion. Yeah.
And they've got, for example, Black Sabbath has a song called "Electric Funeral." They're protesting the nuclear war, and Billy Graham writes "World Aflame," and you've got all of that taking place. And so there's this urgency to spread the gospel, which is a good thing,
right?
But the urgency is because the end is near. And I think the Satanic Panic wraps itself into that, because people see that as a sign of the times and a movement in that direction.
Yeah, I think because if you look at that time period, we talked about it earlier. This movement based on fear, right? And that all sort of meshes together really nicely, I think,
right?
Because a lot of end times prophecy is focused on the same thing, the idea of fear. And should that be the primary motivator to have people follow God, right? To turn themselves over to Jesus? Is it going to be fear, or is it something else?
Well, and a lot of the unraveling of all this for me has been in literally studying what the Scripture actually presents on that. The idea that you got to look at what Jesus had to say about eschatology as well, and the same is true. I always wanted to know, why would somebody want to be on the loser's side?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And so, sure, there are some that actually do join the loser's cause, but
sure,
there weren't this many in the 80s for sure.
No. Yeah, it's such a funny thing, It's history is so fickle. People don't look at it again and see where things have come from. We assume after a moment, this is the way that things have always been,
right?
And this is the way that people have always thought. And if you remember, well, if you don't do this, then you get whipped. Right. You get a whipping, as a kid or whatever. So that means that works. The idea of being scared straight,
right?
Which has been shown in essentially every case,
Well,
from every point of view, doesn't work.
And then in American history, you harken back to something like the Salem witch trials.
Yeah.
That idea of these clandestine meetings in the woods and things like that, they existed.
Sure.
So it wasn't a hard scapegoat to pull up.
Mm-hmm.
It was...
Yeah. It's sort of latching on to like these partial truths almost, and then turning that into something bigger, because the beginnings of this movement, if we circle all the way back, with Dungeons and Dragons, they took something that they thought was a correlation, and made it a causation for this thing. Just because they played that game and then attempted suicide, that doesn't mean that the game caused somebody to commit suicide or to try to. We could say that about serial killers, right? All serial killers wear tennis shoes. So if you wear tennis shoes, you're probably going to be a serial killer, and that's silly. That's not the way that works. Or, he wears pants. Well, we all wear pants. Who cares, right? It has no relevance to the thing. But if you see it once you see it that way, and that becomes the foundation for your thinking, it's hard to get out of that.
Right. Well, and just different fears. Like our parents were more fearful of some things than we are today.
Yeah.
Like we said before,
fear isn't as much of a motivator.
You had the serial killers in the 80s. That was real. And
so like Dahmer.
They were worried about that. They were worried about the whole white van idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got a man in a white van and he's riding down the road, that sort of thing. So it just the whole thing wraps in on itself.
I think so. Yeah, it's sort of, it just gets birthed out of nothing. Just these small little stokes because culture was ripe for it.
Right.
And then it snowballs into this giant thing that turns out to not really be founded on anything in reality. And then it starts to slide away, but it doesn't slide away leaving
never
things
goes all the way away.
No. It's going to leave things unchanged. It's almost like a glacier just made its way across, and it left its mark.
Right.
And it's left its mark on us. It's left its mark on the church, on the future of the church, upon our society. And we have to think about that and our own bias in that.
Well, and the thing
think about what we should do,
and it's odd
today,
because I actually got it from watching horror movies, is that when theology rings true, the devil doesn't have the kind of power that people were giving him.
Yeah,
God is all powerful.
Well, I think
the devil, if anything, has the power that God allows him to have.
Well, we have this kind of, we said earlier, sort of magical thinking. I think people would ascribe the power of evil, to Satan, to the devil, the same kind of power that God has, but in the other direction.
It's almost a duality.
It is. This duality of good versus evil, as if they're equal in some way.
Reality is such that the devil doesn't even come close.
It doesn't. When you think about it on the surface, it doesn't really make sense unless you think there are more than one God, and there's an evil God and a good God. Because that's, I think, the way that Christians think about it, and I think that's what was happening in the 80s without realizing. That I
didn't realize they were good. My aunt, I went and watched a horror movie one time, and right after it, my aunt told me, that you shouldn't give the devil place.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand what she was saying, but at the end of the day, by watching that horror movie, I actually realized that the devil doesn't have that place. He can't have that place because God is too powerful for that.
And again, what's funny, you have things like Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames. We go back to that, which was produced live in churches, and guess what? Still is today. In fact, I looked it up on the website of the ministry that still does it. It's about $5,000 to book them.
Well, the long and the short of that is there's still some truth behind that.
Sure, but when you have a play though, where the most lines of anybody in it are said by the devil.
Oh, okay.
Right.
I didn't realize that.
Yes, the devil is number one. It is the star of the show. And when you're presenting it that way, that is the thing that people remember. And the other thing about it, there's some scenes in some of these. I don't remember now if it's Heaven's Gates or Hell's Flames or Judgment House.
Well, I think the Judgment House one is the one where it's presented where, it's our sin that gets us in that situation.
Sure.
and
I think it's Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, the one I'm thinking of, because
that's the older one.
There's a scene where they die because one person is sharing Christ when they die. I think it's a construction workers up on a beam, one of the skits, or one of the acts of that play, and the beam falls as that person that was being shared to believes in God now. Okay, well, they both show up in heaven, or at the gates rather, because this is all about heaven's gates and everything. And the guy who's been a Christian for a while is able to go right in, and the one who just became a Christian, he can't get in yet because there's some paperwork snafu. That is a weird theological
odd way to look at it.
I don't understand what he's talking about. And so Jesus has to show up and say, no, let him in anyway.
Right.
But, and I get it that they're wanting to introduce Jesus at that moment because he didn't have time to do anything good. But to say that there was a paperwork snafu and he wouldn't let somebody into heaven is a weird theological statement.
I mean, theologically, the thief on the cross didn't have that opportunity.
Exactly. Are we to believe that the thief on the cross showed up at the gates of heaven and they said, man, your paperwork isn't filed correctly? I mean, like there's
Jesus
some...
is the IRS.
We're treating it like it's some bureaucracy.
Right.
And that it's almost like a government organization. That's the last thing that I want God's kingdom to be like, not like a government organization. We want that. You might imagine like the DMV and you go pull a number, or now you have to make appointments weeks in advance. It's a quite silly thing, and so anyway, I think when we get out of that way of thinking and that mindset of of Satan, the adversary, having that kind of a power where he's omnipresent, because he's bothering me, he's bothering you, he's bothering everybody all the time, everywhere. He has this unreal power.
Right.
I mean, it's craziness, but that is the foundation of the Satanic Panic, and everybody could get led astray unintentionally when they're not trying to do that. And I'm of the opinion that you're not going to worship Satan accidentally.
No.
I don't think I don't think that makes any sense.
Right. I do think
you might be worshiping God in ignorance and do something that you maybe shouldn't do. But.
So, I think that the dark side itself could be seductive in the way that Star Wars even presents it.
Sure.
But I don't see how you would consciously make a choice to pull for the loser.
It doesn't have any teeth, in my opinion. It's just so odd. But here we are in the aftermath of it, and all the other stuff now that comes about. I see it on social media all the time. Whether it's Monster Energy drink or some other thing, or some company that is inherently evil and controlled by the Satan itself.
That's getting in another can of worms, right? Procter and Gamble.
Exactly. Procter and Gamble. I remember all that. And all these companies are sort of in bed with Satan in the same way that good guitar players were when they would meet at the crossroads to trade their souls for that. And it's almost like people have that view that companies today do the same thing.
Right.
They've traded their souls, and they may have, in a sense of, profit is everything. It's not really about humanity at all anymore. It's not about doing what's best even for themselves, but we can become full of greed and everything else. But that's not the same thing as like
that. Just goes to show you that
being controlled.
Old stories run strong because that's Faustian myth from German tradition.
Exactly.
Which it's still present.
It is. It is. And so these things leave their mark. And that's the world we have, and where we have to start from. And Jesus came to tell us that we needed to spread the good news, right? Literally, that's what gospel means, the good news. And the good news was that even though you've messed up, Jesus made it okay.
Right.
If we turn to Him. And it's not that there's the evil out there that we have to be afraid of. It's it's here where we have to be concerned. It's here. It's not over there somewhere It's not made in a factory. It's not on an assembly line. It's not something you learned online.
But you just said it's not what goes into a man that makes him.
That's right.
Defiled.
It's what comes out.
It's what comes out.
That's right. So, anyway, I think we're going to finish it up there for this one. We're going to move on to, we have a number of other topics. I hope you may find these conversations interesting. Again, these are random conversations. We don't really have an arrow pointed in a certain way. We know where we start, but we don't know where we finish. And we're going to go ahead and say that that's finished today. So, thanks for coming on, Ben.
All right.
And hope to see you guys back again. Catch you later.